Hi, Madvi.
Hello.
You're set?
I'm all set, yeah.
Okay, we've started. So do you want to
Okay.
go ahead?
Yeah, sorry.
Please, thanks.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Learning Support Funding Compliance. This webinar is kindly sponsored by Cognassist. I'm Madhvi Kumar. I'm the project manager at AELP, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few items just so you know how to participate in today's event. For any questions, please submit them by typing them into the Q&A box, and please do send these in at any time. I will then monitor them and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation or during the presentation itself. We are not taking any questions verbally today, apologies, but it's just because we have so many people on the webinar. But if your questions don't get answered due to time constraints, we will email responses out to everyone afterwards. If you experience any technical issues during this webinar, can you please let us know via the question panel? Once you leave today's webinar, a survey will appear on your screen, and we'd appreciate any feedback, comments, or suggestions that you may have. Without further ado, I'd now like to introduce today's facilitators. We have Rupert Crossland, Director of Audit and Compliance, Professional Assessment Limited, and Dr. Louise Karwowski, Director of Education, Cognassist. Over to you, Rupert.
Hello, thank you, Madhvi. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to introduce myself, I'm Rupert Crossland. As you say, I'm Director of Audit and Compliance at Professional Assessment. We provide audit services to training providers. I've been in that role for a number of years. Before that, I was an audit manager with the ESFA. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Louise Karwowski today. Louise, welcome.
Thank you, Rupert, and thank you, Madhvi. So I'm Louise Karwowski, Director of Education at Cognassist. Cognassist is a screening tool. It's a digital cognitive assessment tool, and we work with all types of provider, colleges, ITPs, universities, and employers as well. I also chair the AELP Learning Support Special Interest Group, and we are meeting next Wednesday if any of you want to join that group as well. Thanks, Rupert.
Excellent. No, thank you. Well, let's hope we don't scare everybody off and they do want to join you next Wednesday. That'll be ideal. Another ideal opportunity to discuss this very interesting topic. Okay. Right. Well, what we're going to do today is cover these objectives. We are going to identify that learning support for reasonable adjustments is in place for learners that require it. We're also going to establish how valid learning support shapes inclusion, retention, and completion, and how to determine learning support funding is robustly optimized, and also having confidence that learning support claims are robust. Now, what I will say is that we're going to focus on the apprenticeship funding rules around learning support. I know obviously it's also offered through adult education budget and advanced learner loans, but the rules for apprenticeships are more prescriptive, more detailed. So to be prudent, we'll focus on those. Certainly you won't go wrong by applying these prudent steps to your other funding streams. Far better to do that than miss out the detail that's required for apprenticeships and leave yourselves exposed in that respect. So that's the focus that we're going to take today. Okay, well, we better begin by defining what is learning support. Many of us think we know what it is, but let's turn to the definition from the ESFA. Now, the funding rules state that learning support funding is available to meet the costs of implementing reasonable adjustments for learners that have a learning difficulty or disability, as defined in the Apprenticeship Skills, Children and Learning Act, where, and I quote, the person has a significant greater detail in learning than the majority of persons of the same age, or the person has a disability which either prevents or hinders that person from making use of facilities of a kind generally provided by institutions providing education or training for persons who are over compulsory school age. Okay, that's the jargon. In simple terms, for learning support to be funded, there must be a learning difficulty or a disability that impacts on their ability to learn to complete the programme. And by the programme, for apprenticeships, it includes the endpoint assessment as well as the practical period. That's what it is. I want to mention what it's not, because that's crucial, and that's something that we see so often in our audits, and we need to advise colleagues in the sector about what it's not. Do avoid pitfalls that have caught out others before. Learning support funding is not available for merely having a lot to learn on the programme. For example, if they have no prior knowledge or are new to the industry, or if they're at a low starting level of functional skills without having a learning difficulty, or some aspects of the programme being more detailed or complex than others, or more stretching and challenging and consequently taking longer to assimilate, or environmental factors such as being busy at work, or having fallen behind in their programme because of missed sessions or because of deficiencies in delivery, or other such issues that are not learning difficulties or disability. Now, some of these might sound quite obvious. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence when I say things like being busy. I've actually seen that in learner files. They are assumptions that certain providers have been tempted into using to claim learning support. For that reason, the ESFA auditors, they're highly tuned to spot anything like this in providers' records where there is learning support to be audited. Another thing I'd say is do not confuse learning needs with learning difficulties. I hear this phrase learning needs used when really what providers are driving at is learning difficulties, because we all have learning needs of one type or another. Let's face it, your learners would not be on the programme if they had nothing to learn. And also, good learning can be and arguably should be challenging at times. Learning content that is challenging and learning needs are not the same as specific learning difficulties or disabilities. So do please keep that distinction in mind when it comes to assessing your learners. Avoid using the term learning needs in connection with learning support, so those two concepts do not get blurred in colleagues' minds over time. As I say, unfortunately, I've seen this at providers, and then they start to use invalid reasons for claiming learning support and justifying it. Now, naturally, the rules go on to state that before learning support funding claim can be made, an assessment must be made, and that will determine whether an apprentice has a learning difficulty or disability that directly impacts on their ability to complete the programme. Why? Well, that's a signal from the ESFA of the importance of the assessment. As a provider, you're accountable for whether there is proper reasoning for providing the support and for claiming the support. To meet that accountability, you need to establish whether there is a learning difficulty or disability that actually impacts on learning. You need to know why the support is being delivered and claimed for, in other words, and therefore that defends your actions and your funding if questioned by the ESFA. Your assessment must be fit for purpose as documented evidence demonstrating the learner's difficulty or disability, and that way you're going to avoid the pitfalls. When it comes to the assessment, well, this year the apprenticeship funding rules for learning support contain mostly subtle changes, but there's one fundamental change. I'm going to quote this. As part of the initial assessment, which is an eligible cost, the provider must undertake a screening exercise for learning support. Now, that's an interesting about turn on what we saw in draft apprenticeship rules a couple of years ago, which actually ruled this out. Now it's very much ruled in as a mandatory requirement. Now you need to ensure your initial assessment of apprentices includes this screening exercise. The rules go on to state, and again I'm going to quote, where this assessment identifies potential learning difficulties or disabilities, and before a claim for learning support funding can be made, the provider may need to undertake a further detailed assessment to identify whether an apprentice has a learning difficulty or disability that directly impacts their ability to complete the apprenticeship on which they are enrolled. Now, that's a steer from the ESFA. When you read the rules, look out for steers. That's a steer to complete a full assessment to gauge the impact of the learning difficulty and what that has on their ability to complete the programme. And that also equips you to devise a plan of learning support that will meet those difficulties. Now, as a starting point, here are some questions to consider. I'd actually take time to consider these with your colleagues. Do you always carry out an assessment for anyone whose initial screening indicates they may potentially need learning support? And also think about how you assess and think about how the assessment is recorded. Always have in mind that just because a learner has reported having a learning difficulty in their application or their initial screening detects a potential difficulty, it doesn't necessarily follow that the reasonable adjustments are going to be necessary for them to complete. While they may have struggled at school some time ago in that classroom environment of the past, your regular approach to delivering your programme with your staff, your materials, your regular approach and your methods of training, they might be the right approach for them and much more conducive to learning than they've experienced previously, where they drew an assumption of having a learning difficulty. in which case they wouldn't require the adjustments. So that's why you need the screening and the detailed assessment. That gives you that insight. Think of the assessment as shining a light on the difficulties. The ESFA themselves do not specify a format for the initial screening or for the more detailed assessment. Now that's good news. That gives you flexibility to devise your own method and content of assessment. And there's a very good reason for this. They want it to be tailored to your ways of working and your programs. Your assessment must be fit for purpose, and by that it's got to be your purpose. Now, what we can say is what it says on the slide in front of you now. The assessment must identify if a difficulty or disability exists, it must define that difficulty or disability, and it must explain how the difficulty or disability will impact on their learning. But also it must show the consequences for completion if reasonable adjustments are not put in place. That last point is mandatory in the funding rules. That is an expectation. Your assessment must identify if a difficulty or disability directly impacts on the ability to complete the programme. It's a point I've said already before, but it's so critical. That's why I'm reiterating it. You need to consider the results of the assessment. Is the assessment showing they will not complete their apprenticeship without the reasonable adjustments? Without the adjustments, detail here how they're going to struggle because of their learning difficulty or disability, but not for any other reason. Ultimately, are these adjustments essential for them to complete? Not merely desirable or optional adjustments or compensation for other causal factors not related to their learning difficulty or disability. That's what you need to be getting across in the assessment. Look at it critically and check that. Now, a common sense check is to remember the assessment is the basis for your funding. When you claim learning support, you're drawing down at least £150 of funding every month. And in the ESFA's eyes, that's taxpayers' money from the public purse. So you've got to put yourself in their mindset and say to yourself, does that assessment demonstrate that the difficulty and the need for reasonable adjustments is such that this level of funding is necessary? That's the viewpoint of the ESFA. That's how errors creep in. They'll have that viewpoint. If they're not convinced, you're going to risk not only your funding, but also your reputation. So critically look at it from that perspective. And also an assessment must be revealing and enlightening. It mustn't shore up assumptions. Beware of learner assumptions around supposed difficulties. The learner may previously have been led to believe they have a difficulty, but not had a robust assessment. Assessment will prove the accurate position, so you don't rely on assumptions or labels they've just been given or assumed. Go back to some of your learner files and check your assessment achieve this. Ultimately, the assessment has one job to do. It needs to make clear why learning support is being delivered. Is that decision grounded in evidence facts? Look at your assessments and sense check with a critical eye and ask yourself, do they achieve that? Because this is not only important to you, that assessment will be read by various colleagues, because we know in practice, I've seen it, and I know everyone here today online will have seen it, experienced this, we know in practice move between staff over time. The assessment will also be read by the learner and the employer if the learner gives permission for you to share it with them. Okay. Talked quite a lot there about the assessment, but I've talked about it because it is so critical and I don't want to gloss over it. Now, having assessed that reasonable adjustments are necessary to complete the programme, the funding rules state that a documented and clear plan of support should be produced by the provider. Documented and clear are key words here. We'll look at those in more detail in a moment, but also the rules state that the plan must be signed as agreed by the apprentice and with the apprentice's consent shared with the employer. So your starting point for the plan is to return to that assessment and determine the reasonable adjustments necessary for them to complete and the order in which those adjustments should be provided. Reasonable adjustments are not defined by the ESFA. They are learner specific. But have in mind that a reasonable adjustment is modification of your delivery, adding to it, tailoring it, making it more suitable for the learner to complete their program because of the difficulties and disabilities. It's implicit as well that there's an additional cost in providing the reasonable adjustments, and indeed the funding rules require there is evidence of the costs of the reasonable adjustments, particularly where you're exceeding the £150 a month. If there is no additional costs, it's not eligible for learning support funding. So determine whether there are additional costs for providing the learning support over and above your regular delivery. Now, the funding rules state that learning support is a fixed amount of £150 per month, which can only be claimed by the provider each month where reasonable adjustments are delivered, evidenced, and result in a monetary cost. These costs may be related to either the cost of staff time or specific equipment. As we can see on screen, additional staff to support the learner, extended or more frequent assessor visits, specialist equipment, or enabling additional time on exams and tests. Moreover, now determine whether the costs are likely to be over the £150 a month. If they are, you can claim it, but you will need systems for capturing the actual costs. You'll need to keep the evidence of the expenditure. You can claim the excess of the £150 over the £150 via the earnings adjustment statement. So your colleagues that are responsible for the ILR, if that's not you directly here online today, they're going to need to work with your finance colleagues and achieve that between themselves and make sure that those systems are in place. Now, as well as the financial implications, there are some important governance considerations. I'm thinking back to what we set out as objectives to begin with today. We've already established that there are reasonable adjustments without which the learner cannot complete. In other words, you're charged with planning and implementing measures which prevent exclusion. Providing the adjustment should therefore be part of your inclusion strategy. Robust planning of learning support therefore has legal, reputational and ethical considerations. So because of that, the planning is not to be taken lightly. Your colleagues who plan learning support reasonable adjustments should be knowledgeable in the range of measures that education research shows are suitable for the individual learner's difficulties. Supporting them there where there is the circumstances that we read earlier in the rules. I'm going to quote that again. The person has a significant greater difficulty in learning than the majority of persons of the same age. Every learner has a right to be given the best chance to complete their program. So you do that by planning effective learning support that will mitigate their specific learning difficulty. That's actually going to be positive for your retention and success rates if you do that. So consequently, it's good practice to have a learning support policy to facilitate a consistent approach and a consistent understanding of how learning support will be applied. So determine how long the learner will need to receive the support. The deciding factor for this is how long will the learning difficulty or disability impact on the learning. Is it going to be for the entire program, or could it be for a short time to overcome the difficulty or disability for a specific learning objective? A simpler example, just to illustrate this, could be if the learning support was there to address the impact of dyscalculia, you could reasonably conclude that you would need to plan learning support up to the planned end date of functional skills maths. That's an example. Or it could just be for a period of time to reach the point where the impact of the difficulty or disability is diminished to a point that they're able to complete through your regular delivery model. So the documented and clear plan must comprehensively set out how, when, where, and who will deliver those reasonable adjustments. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. To say the ESFA are not prescriptive in their expectations of the plan, but some hints here. Experience from our audits suggests a robust plan should be broken down by month because you're going to deliver each month. Show the additional reasonable adjustments to be made that month and describe them. For example, additional sessions or additional time at a session. They should detail the additional content and methods and techniques required and detail the additional resource to be used. And they should show who will deliver the intervention. For example, is it the regular trainer or are you calling upon a specialist for it? So taking all of that into account, the ESFA expect the plan to formalise a series of milestones for the learner. A watertight plan is going to enable them to overcome their difficulty or disability and ultimately complete their programme. Once again, use that critical eye, sense check the content of the plan. Does it achieve this? So that's the plan in terms of its content, but it's also important to ensure it's effective by making it user-friendly, a plan that can be picked up and followed by anyone with responsibility for progressing the learner at any time, given the potential for staff changes, and make it relevant to the learner as well. Focus on giving them what they need, tailor it. Do not just use a generic support offer that you give to every single learner, irrespective of their own personal needs. If you're not prepared to plan to meet their needs, it's likely to be less effective anyway, so you're not going to support them as well as they're potentially requiring. In which case, not only are they less likely to complete, but ultimately apprentices and employers may decide to go elsewhere. So you really don't want to risk that. You're managing your risk by taking this action. And finally, with the plan, make it a live document. It should be an accurate reflection of the learner and the plan support throughout their time on program. If it's not going to be user-friendly and it's not going to be relevant, as you can see there. So over time, if you find the plan is no longer relevant to what they need or what you propose to deliver because of what they need, go ahead and update the plan. Now, learning support funding may only be claimed when delivery of the reasonable adjustment commences. That's why the funding rules require you to provide evidence and documented details of the necessary reasonable adjustments that have been delivered in that period. It's also why the ESFA make the point in this year's funding rules for apprenticeships that the detailed assessment is not eligible to be funded by them. When it comes to learning support funding, this is only payable when delivery of support has taken place. Now, again, there's no prescribed format for the evidence. What the ESFA will do, though, they'll check for correlation between the plan and the support actually delivered. It makes sense, therefore, to record your evidence of delivery with the same metrics as you have in the plan. As we can see on screen now, the date of the session, details of the reasonable adjustments provided do be specific. It's not enough to say that you, for example, helped a learner with their learning. Say, how did you help them to learn? What specifically did you do that was different and additional to your regular provision? And demonstrate that there's been additional time, resources, or specialist methods of delivery employed to address that learning difficulty. Remember that the additional funding is there to meet the additional costs of putting the reasonable adjustments in place. I'd also detail there the staff involved in the provision and the outcomes of the learning support session and of applying reasonable adjustments. What's the learner gained from this particular session of reasonable adjustments? How have they progressed towards completion? And that's going to lead us on to evaluation. But we'll come on to evaluation in just a moment. And also here, if you're claiming more than £150 a month, you need to keep evidence of the actual cost of the reasonable adjustments. With the critical eye, I've said that a couple of times already, but it's so important. Critical eye, check this evidence of delivery against the plan. The trainer's manager or your quality team could have a role here. It's a critical point to the ESFA, so put a pair of critical eyes on it. Does the learning support delivery deviate from the plan? If so, why? If it doesn't appear relevant to their assessed learning difficulty and therefore the plan, it's going to be reasonable for the ESFA to challenge you on this, and that could potentially put the funds at risk. If, however, your practice have changed to better meet the assessed needs, either because the original strategy was not enabling the learner to progress, or because you've updated your learning support delivery approach, then you update your plan, and then it will tie in with your delivery. Now, there must be evidence of delivery for each month that you claim learning support funding for apprenticeships. So it means you need a system of capturing when it's being delivered and a process for getting that information to your MI colleagues for them to ensure learning support claims only remain in the ILI each month that delivery takes place. So that's an area where operational and MI colleagues are going to need to liaise and use technology to best effect to work out the best course of action for getting that information to ensure that the ILR accurately reflects what's being delivered. Okay, I'm going to talk about evaluation now. Evaluation of learning support to determine whether it should continue is more prominent in this year's apprenticeship rules. With this paragraph, and again, I'm going to quote, ongoing delivery and the need for learning support must be reviewed on a monthly basis. Where the review determines that learning support funding is no longer needed, providers must immediately stop claiming these payments by updating the ILR appropriately. And it goes on. The provider has documented evidence of monthly reviews being undertaken throughout the apprenticeship to ensure that the reasonable adjustments are still necessary and appropriate for the apprenticeship. The evidence confirms the effectiveness of the reasonable adjustments and how these have been adapted where necessary. Where amendments to the original plan are required, these will need to be documented, signed off by the apprentice, and evidenced accordingly. I'm going to pick up on two words there as I move you on to the next slide: necessary and appropriate. And for necessary, establish whether the difficulty is still impacting on their ability to complete, given the support provided and the stage in their apprenticeship they've now reached. Put simply, do they still need the support? They may not need the support to continue if, say, it was for an element of the program they've now completed. We used that example of maths earlier. Or if your support has fully addressed the difficulty and they're now able to progress with your regular model of provision. But if there is a continuing necessity, learning support can and should continue. If not, you would cease the activity and cease the support and turn it off in the ILR. And for appropriate, you need to determine whether the support is addressing their learning difficulties and enabling them to progress. If you've delivered according to your support plan, they should be on schedule according to the learning plan. If they're not, determine whether that's due to the appropriateness and effectiveness of the reasonable adjustments, or is it due to other reasons? If the reasonable adjustments continue to be appropriate because they are addressing a difficulty that would otherwise still prevent them from achieving, you should continue with the learning support. But if they don't appear appropriate, you should consider either amending the support and therefore the plan, or if you need to cease delivering the support, turn it off in the ILR. And you must, as the rules state, evaluate whether reasonable adjustments are necessary and appropriate in monthly reviews. Evidence that evaluation alongside recording the delivery of reasonable adjustments each month. Now, because of this increased emphasis on evaluation, just a few questions to ask yourselves as a takeaway from today. I'd ask once again, ask yourself critically amongst your colleagues, because the ESFA they're going to ask you critically. So use this as a moment to actually test yourself in that respect. How do you evaluate? Are your evaluation processes fit for purpose? And do you always evaluate after each session? Does it cover necessity and appropriateness, those two key words that we saw a moment ago? And does your evaluation detect limitations in your practices? And if it does, do you address them? That's the funding rules. And those are ways in which you can meet the rules and ensure compliance and assure your funding. So I've just put on this screen my contact details. You're welcome to contact me after today's session, but we do have time for a Q&A session, so looking forward to that. But at that point, I'm now going to hand over to Louise, because I know you have some very important points to discuss with colleagues.
Thank you so much, Rupert. That was really informative and clear. We've had loads of questions, I'm pleased to say. And there was a comment as well from a delegate saying this is an absolute minefield, and providers feel, because it is so tricky, that it dissuades providers from claiming learning support funding, even though learning support is being delivered to learners who need it. So this sort of information, this sort of clarification of the rules is so pertinent, so important. And as you say, the change for mandatory screening is a subtle one, very subtle. In fact, a lot of providers have missed it. But it's a really important one. It's a hugely positive step in the right direction for inclusion, for equality, but also equity. So you need to be screening all your learners as part of the initial assessment process, and that is the fairest way to be doing it. We've identified a lot of learners with hidden cognitive learning difficulties. Sometimes this is a surprise to even the learner themselves, but when they get the result through the Cognassist assessment, it's like a light bulb moment. They realise that is the reason why they've been struggling through their education. So yeah, absolutely important. So just to reiterate the update, so as part of initial assessment, which is an eligible cost, the provider must undertake a screening exercise for learning support. Following this, and the wording is may, isn't it? You may undertake a further detailed assessment to identify whether an apprentice has a learning difficulty or disability that directly impacts their ability to complete the apprenticeship on which they are enrolled. So that needs assessment is related to the equity point I made, because everybody's needs are different. People's barriers are different. You may have two learners with the same diagnosis, but they have very different requirements in terms of reasonable adjustments. You know, there are different flavours to learning difficulties and disabilities, and we shouldn't treat people the same. We shouldn't tar everyone with the same brush. So it's really important to be having that needs assessment discussion with any learner that presents with a learning difficulty or disability. You may have learners that actually have gone through previous education with a lot of support. So they have their toolkit, they have their assistive technologies that they're trained in, they're well versed in, and they may not need support. So actually that needs assessment discussion is exploring, is support required? If so, how much? And it's a really good time to discuss potential reasonable adjustments as well. Something important to drop in there is that term reasonable adjustments. Your learners might not be familiar with that. It's a term that is linked to legislation, it's linked to the Equality Act, and they might not understand that. So you may want to phrase things differently. You might want to talk about things like, you know, did you have additional support at school? Did you have anything like extra time in your exams, in your GCSEs or your A-level exams, for example? And that way you can get your reasonable adjustment discussion out of the learner. And then the third point is you need a support plan. So evidence is absolutely crucial when it comes to learning support funding. You need a learning support guidance document. You need to be delivering support to meet the apprentice's identified needs and then review progress and continuing needs as appropriate. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the 5 pillars of a quality learning support journey. So this is a really simple way that you can check that you are providing the correct support according to ESFA rules, but also Ofsted and quality. So there are 5 pillars: identify, plan, support, review, and then prepare and progress onto the next step. So I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail shortly. But first, I want to talk about the monthly review. So this is crucial. This is crucial for many reasons. If you have agreed a support plan with a learner and you've talked about various reasonable adjustments that you want to try with that learner, that monthly review is your opportunity to review the impact of any reasonable adjustments you are putting in place for that learner. So you've got time on programme to be trying things out. You know, if this is a learner who's just been identified with a learning difficulty, they may not have had any previous support. You don't know what's going to work off the bat. So you want to explore reasonable adjustments during the programme and then mirror them at endpoint assessment. So as an example, a learner might struggle with reading. You might want to explore human reading support, or you might want to explore digital, so assistive technologies such as text-to-speech software. These things are not quick to adapt to. So something you might check with the learner is, okay, so over the last month, we set a target for you to review several documents using this free text-to-speech solution. How did that go for you? Is it working? Is it not working? And you need to be documenting that conversation as well. You want to try other adjustments as well. So don't just have a blanket approach to this. You want to see what other adjustments could work for the learner. And quite frequently, reasonable adjustments don't have to cost anything. They might just be strategies that you're trying with the learner to see what works for them. And you want to see the impact of those adjustments against progress for the standards. So knowledge, skills, and behaviours. Is access to that reasonable adjustment reducing the barrier to completion of the programme? You want to be assessing all learners at the start of programme to ascertain an accurate starting point, because then you can measure and review against that starting point, and you can be providing ambitious targets for learners right from the start. The aim of this is to give learners the correct tools, tailored tools, to self-manage and to become more independent in their studies. And there's a quote there from Nick Preston, who's head of quality and education at Education Wise, who have been working with us for some time now. So he says the real difference has been having Cognassist embedded at the start. Learners that have engrossed themselves in it from the beginning have seen the power of it. And it's been able to support them, not only in their work, but around their life and dealing with different areas. We also support tutors with understanding all of this. We help tutors understand what a cognitive learning difficulty looks like, what reasonable adjustments are appropriate to support the different flavours of the cognitive learning difficulty. And our system supports learners as well. So the question here is, how do you make sure you're doing this correctly? How do you quality assure the above? Okay, so going back to our QAF, our Quality Assurance Framework for Learning Support, you can see under each pillar, there are more detailed points. Just go back to that slide. So for identify, this encompasses accessible IAG, information, advice and guidance, prior to learning, screening for learning difficulties and or disabilities, initial assessment, the needs assessment falls into this identification step as well, diagnostic assessments, English and maths, which all feed into the starting point. And you can see in bold at the bottom of each pillar, there are the 3 eyes, Ofsted's 3 eyes threaded through this quaff. So questions you could be asking yourself for the identification step. How effective is your LDD strategy? Are you assessing all learners? Do you have a process in place to be doing that? As Rupert said, this is now a mandatory requirement, and that came into play on the 1st of August. So if you don't have a process, you need to be thinking of that quite urgently. Do you have sufficient funding? Do you provide sufficient resources for your team? And do you train your staff in understanding how to support learners with learning difficulties and/or disabilities? Are you scrutinising your data processes? Are you looking at progress in year? Are you looking at achievement gaps for learners with LDD versus learners without? Moving on to plan. So this is formation of the support plan based on any needs identified in terms of requirements for reasonable adjustments. It also encompasses reasonable adjustments on programme and, of course, off-the-job training. This is where you start considering drawing down LSF as well. And of course, now you need consent from the learner. So this support plan needs to be signed off by the learner and agreement from the employer with the learner's consent. So questions you could be asking yourself here are you meeting the learner's needs? Are the outcomes of initial assessment being used to form a plan? Is this being embedded into the curriculum? And is progression and independence being supported? Which takes us on to the 3rd pillar, which is support. So this is all about achievement of knowledge, skills and behaviour according to the standard, off-the-job training, inclusive teaching, providing inclusive learning. You want to be thinking about assessment already at this stage as well, and accessible resources. Questions you could be asking: is your curriculum ambitious for LDD learners? This is something that Ofsted look at in their inspections. Are reasonable adjustments appropriate for needs, or are you just providing blanket reasonable adjustments for everybody? Are the reasonable adjustments provided appropriate for formative and summative assessment, including at endpoint? Review. Review, as we said, is absolutely crucial in this process. You need to be measuring progress according to the standard. You want to be assessing impact of reasonable adjustments against success. You want to be looking at targets. Are the targets achievable? Are they stretch targets? Are you stretching your learners with LDD? Or are they just getting by? Is appropriate support being provided? So this is not just for learners who have support being provided for them. This is also for learners that maybe have declined support at the initial stages. You need to be checking in with them on a monthly basis as well, because as course complexity increases, people's requirements might change. So learners who thought they might be fine without any additional support at the start of a programme may actually change their minds later down the line when things become more difficult. So that monthly review conversation is crucial to providing quality support. And this all leads to prepare. Is your learner prepared sufficiently for summative assessment, for endpoint assessment? Have they got the right reasonable adjustments applied for their endpoint assessment? Any reasonable adjustments that are working for them on programme need to be mirrored at endpoint as well. And this can't be down as special circumstances on the day of assessment. This needs to be applied for well in advance, so everybody is prepared on the day. And what we're looking at here is achievement. We want learners with learning difficulties and/or disabilities to achieve at the same rate as their non-LDD peers with the reasonable adjustment support that is in place. And this is all for progression. We want our learners to go on to the next step. We want our learners to succeed. We want our learners to go on to advanced study or retain their employment. Again, going back to the data point, are you assessing that? Are you looking at achievement data for learners with LDD? Are you looking at how many reasonable adjustment applications were made in that year and how many were rejected? or reapplied for, what went wrong with that process. You really need to have a focus on your learners with LDD, not just for compliance purposes, but also for moral and ethical reasons. So what do we want from all of this? We want independent, confident, and resilient apprentices who achieve, are ambitious for their futures, and are prepared to move on to their next steps. And remember, any success with reasonable adjustments that you meet for that learner isn't just for that program. They will go on to take those reasonable adjustments and strategies with them for their future careers and education. And what does this have to do with LSF? Well, funding rules state all apprentices should have initial screening. This is mandatory. Cognassist provides an initial screener to sit alongside English and Maths functional skills tests. And we establish very quickly everybody's starting point, which is intent. We enable tutors to very quickly set targets, again, meeting intent. We support learning with learning plans. This is implementation. We help providers to adjust their teaching through tailored means and strategies, again, meeting the implementation eye. We help measure progress, impact, and we help plan reasonable adjustments for endpoint assessment. So every learner who is identified with a cognitive difficulty through our assessment receives a robust report which documents which reasonable adjustments should be applied for or discussed with the learner for each assessment modality. So we really help providers on that journey. Okay, and now I'd like to welcome Rupert back and Madhvi for our Q&A. We've got a lot of questions, so we've got a lot to cover, Rupert.
Okay, fine, good. Well, that just shows what an interesting and important topic this is. Thank you, Louise. That was really informative, and yeah, very interested to see how what's available can actually meet those needs.
Yes, I'll start off with the questions. We have, as you both know, several pouring in. So I'll go for the first one. There's a lot of discussion about risk of clawback from ESFA audits. What experience do you have with providers you work with and audit clawbacks for ALS claims?
I'll take that one. Yes, I've seen it rather a lot. The ESFA know that it is a risky area. They know that it is an area that providers struggle with in terms of evidencing it or indeed accurately claiming it. So it is something that the auditors they take very seriously. As I said earlier, it's additional money. They see it's additional money so that they're there to protect, to ensure that those rules have been met. So if learning support has been claimed invalidly, or there are no records or insufficient records to support it, and they cannot be obtained during the audit, then potentially funds could be at risk, most certainly.
Thank you. And we have a very new apprenticeship training provider with us today who's interested in finding out more about help for learning and how do they get about this?
Well, I think we've gone through a lot of the details of what's required there. In terms of the help for learning, it would need to be someone that would understand the specialisms of what's required for a particular learner to accurately plan to meet those needs for a learner.
Yeah, great. And we have a delegate asking if they are able to claim for funding for learners who have not had any statements or EHC previously, and yet they've been asked for support on the initial guidance or discussion.
Well, that's where you'd go through the process that we've discussed. Every learner has to have the initial screening that Louise went through, and then if that initial screening suggests that support is required, you would then conduct that full assessment and then determine whether it's required. So learners do not have to have an EHCP in order to qualify for learning support funding. It may well be that they've not gone through that EHCP process prior to coming to you, and they may not actually require it, but it's just a case of a separate process here of screening and then assessment.
Just to interject there, Rupert, actually we've had a few questions around this EHCP. If a learner starts program with an existing form of diagnosis, like an EHCP or an educational psychologist report. Does that count as the initial screening exercise, or would that still have to be conducted?
According to the funding rules, every learner has to go through initial screening. The funding rules do not say if they have an EHCP, a statement, an LDA, anything like that, they're exempt from it. They still have to go through it. Now, without speaking for the ESFA, because I'm not employed by them and I haven't been for about a decade now, but obviously the idea behind the screening is actually something that is tailored by the provider, and actually think of the programs that they deliver. So you tailor your initial screening to actually determine how the having had a report of difficulties, how they could manifest themselves, and therefore think about the kinds of support that you'd need to apply. It informs your staff along the way as to how they're going to provide support if they've gone through all the processes that all the learners, that every learner would go through, that you have a consistent process for each learner. It means that there's a consistent process and policy is followed for each learner if you do that.
Thank you. And Louise, you suggested that the IA process is an eligible cost. Does that include the extra time collating the evidence required to meet the audit requirements as well?
That's one for Rupert, I think.
Yes. Extra time to collate the evidence. I mean, that in itself isn't an eligible cost. The eligible costs are around the delivery rather than taking time to evidence. The ESFA like the phrase naturally occurring, so one wouldn't expect that there'd be material amounts of time taken to capture the evidence itself.
Thank you. And there are two questions, I'm just going to club them. Does the learner need to be made aware that LSF is being claimed, and does the apprentice have to sign off against the monthly support?
They do need to be made aware because they have to sign the plan. And I was also put almost to the extent of why wouldn't you, that learners should be fully engaged, fully informed, that there should be transparency about the program. So therefore, you would be asking them you have to ask them to sign the plan. In terms of signing off support, yes, in any form like that, where if the learner signs off the support to say, yes, this has happened, that gives you robust evidence that has been authenticated by the learner. It's definitely a good process to have in place.
Thanks. And also, even though you may do all of the screening and initial assessments, there are occasions where a couple of months later into the apprenticeship, the learner will identify with their assessor that they have a learning difficulty. Can you then apply for the LSF at this stage?
The door isn't closed. You can apply for it, but I would want to reassess, because you've completed it. If you've completed an assessment, a screening and an assessment which indicates they do not need support, and then a difficulty is coming to light, then reassess and actually determine it. So you must have those stages of evidence that stack up. You couldn't put forward a learner for funding and say they've been assessed as not needing support, but we've claimed it anyway. You would have to do a new assessment to support your claim.
Right. Thank you. Right. Okay, also, are they able to claim LSF if the apprentice has surpassed their end date and they're an overstay on the program?
Again, it can be done, but an auditor is going to want to know why. So a program duration is at least 12 months, very often longer than 12 months. So detail the reasons why it's taken beyond the planned end date for it to come to light that the difficulty exists. It can happen. We're not saying it's entirely impossible, but one would expect that to be fairly exceptional, and that normally in the course of working with the learner from the initial screening and the more detailed assessment and a year plus of delivering to them, one would hope that would come to light. On occasion, it may not. So again, you need a full audit trail of how that's happened, how it's come to light so late, and therefore then go through the assessment process and actually determine it, that there is the difficulty there, because the ESFA will be wary of the potential providers to reach for learning support just because somebody has gone past. That shouldn't be a reason for triggering learning support. There still has to be the underlying difficulty or disability that is impacting on their ability to learn.
Right. And do they still then need to complete a support plan if a learner has no needs identified?
if they have no needs identified,
Yeah.
that's a nice easy one. No, they wouldn't need to produce a plan because there'd be nothing to plan. They wouldn't be on learning support.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down to see the new questions come in. Sorry. Okay, if a student provides a diagnostic assessment, example, dyslexia, ESC, can we use that as the screening tool then, followed up with a needs assessment to check information is still accurate? Or do we still need to do another screening?
That's similar to the first question we had, isn't it? Now, there's still that expectation. There is the initial screening.
Okay, great. And how do the monthly modules come into the support?
So the Cognassist modules. So the learners complete modules tailored to their cognitive learning difficulty and also program level. So right from level 1 right through to level 7. That is not sufficient to claim LSF. There has to be support provided, additional support provided by the tutor. So the intervention reports that we provide through our system guide the tutor with this conversation. So you need to be reviewing the strategy with the learner, the impact of that strategy. Did it work? Did it not work? And how can you then feed it into the routine with the learner to establish the correct support? So there needs to be that conversation with the learner, which can feed into that monthly review.
Right. Okay. And can the providers claim for equipment that we need to purchase for individual disabled students to meet their personalized needs?
Yes, they can. Yes, that is part of the learning support funding can be used for purchase of equipment. As I said before, if it's over £150, then you will need to evidence that. You will need the evidence of the expenditure, and you will need to be able to tie it in again. Your assessment should show that that learner does specifically need that piece of equipment.
Right. Thank you. And can they assess anxiety and mental health and then conclude that this is a barrier for learning and therefore claim LSF?
That is a potential, yes. I always draw the distinction between anxious and anxiety. So if someone feels anxious, that's not necessarily a learning difficulty or disability, but anxiety and mental health issues can be. Again, you need an assessment which actually properly shines a light on how those particular conditions impact on their ability to learn. Isn't enough to just say the learner suffers from anxiety. You need to explore that with the learner. And again, rightly so, you explore how it manifests itself, and then you can plan accordingly.
Right. And on the back of that, do we need to have a medical report from a GP for a learner who has developed mental health issues and then claim ALS? So do they have to have a medical report from the GP?
There's no expectation in the funding rules that you would have that, but any assessment, whoever conducts it has to feel sufficiently confident and competent to do that. So if you have the expertise within your organisation to do that, you can. If you need to go to a third party, then do so.
Right. And if they have more than one ALS session with a learner in a particular month, are they able to claim for that as well?
It's one payment per month.
One, okay. Right. And is an exam adjustment assessment sufficient to claim if there is no EHCP or need flag?
It wouldn't, as I said before, you wouldn't need an EHCP, but you would still need the types of evidence we discussed. So you'd still need the assessment and the screening, the assessment, and the plan.
Right. And the 150 you spoke about, do the monthly costs actually need to be a total of 150 per month, or are they able to claim the monthly 150? Does it have to sum up to 150?
No, it doesn't. Up to 150, the ESFA is not looking for evidence of those costs. So if it doesn't cost exactly £150, it's not a problem. You don't have to maintain that level of evidence. It's only where you wish to claim over 150. But it must be evident that there has been something additional, and therefore there has been additional costs incurred, typically either through staff time or through resources that have been provided.
Right. And Louise, you spoke about this, but just to reiterate, are the cost of Cognassist packages described eligible to claim back from LS?
I mean, that's one for Rupert, isn't it? Is the screening is an initial assessment step, which is an eligible cost. Rupert, do you want to explain a little bit more about that eligible cost bit?
Yes. So the initial screening is not part of claiming learning support. So initial screening does not entitle you to claim £150. It's an eligible cost in terms of being on programme, just like all the other eligible costs that are detailed in the funding rules for apprenticeships. So that's part of the eligible cost, because every learner, irrespective of whether or not they're going to require learning support, will go through that. You may find that it may well be, without prejudicing it, it may be the majority of learners do not need learning support, but they still go through the screening. So it's not a trigger for learning support. Neither is the assessment itself, the more detailed assessment. That's not a trigger for claiming learning support. You can't simply do the detailed assessment and say, right, we can claim £150 on the basis of this. The £150 that is related to the cost of delivering the learning support.
Okay. I know I've asked you this question before, but seems like there's some clarity required still. Do they still need to do the initial screening if the learner already has EHCP?
Yes, they do. It's quite clear in the funding rules that initial screening, as part of initial assessment, it must be undertaken.
Right, okay. And can you claim for learning support for the discussion with the learner and putting the plan together for the learner if they have been identified on Cognassist? No?
I'm on mute. Cognassist is an acceptable screening tool, as we've discussed. So as long as you follow the steps that Rupert has documented in this session, and that the learner qualifies in terms of requirements, then there should be no problem at all.
But again, it's related to delivery. It's only at the point of delivery does the claiming start. Delivery of the learning support.
Okay, I'll take one more question because we're close to time, but we have a provider who's using NCFE Fast, which diagnoses English and Maths and ALS soft needs. Is that enough?
So I suppose it's functional skills, the results of functional skills test, Rupert. Is that enough to qualify?
Not in itself, no. As we remember the pitfalls I talked about earlier, and maybe having one of them was having a long way to climb in terms of functional skills. Having a long way to climb in terms of functional skills, that's not a learning difficulty or disability. That's just the distance they have to cover. Is there a difficulty or disability that is impacting it? It may be there is a causal factor that is a learning difficulty or disability. That's what the initial screening and the more detailed assessment will actually probe and actually find out. Is that the causal factor behind the low scores there?
Mm-hmm. That has been really informative, Rupert and Louise. I'm sure our delegates have a lot to take away from this. We have several questions that have not been answered yet, but as I said at the beginning, we will answer your questions. We'll send an email around once we're done with the session. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. A quick reminder, AELP, as you see on the screen now, have a selection of webinars on offer, and we have added some onto the slide here. To see the full lineup, please visit our website. We have our AELP's EDI Summit taking place at the BCEC Birmingham on the 26th of September, and our autumn conference is taking place at the Midland Manchester on the 31st of October. You get one free place for the EDI Summit, if you're a member, so yeah, please sign up. As members, anyone from your organization can access the AELP member benefits, including the weekly countdown newsletter and Ask Ashworth. So if you need any assistance with that, please contact our admin team. Once you leave today's webinar, a survey will appear on your screen, and we'd appreciate if you could spare a minute or two to complete that, please. On behalf of Stuart, Rupert, Louise, and everyone, thank you for joining us today.